I don't care about making already wealthy people wealthier. She opened up her lecture to 400 people by peeling a banana on stage. I really derive a lot of my success from two factors, which is luck and people believing in me.
Toland is a senior product manager consultant in Columbus, Ohio, focusing on coaching and strategy engagement. He's currently consulting with a Fortune 50, not quite with healthcare logistics company on data mesh and data strategy. He also volunteers as treasurer on the board of directors for New Leaders Council. In his free time, he sings with the Columbus Symphony, engages with local politics and nonprofit efforts, and is obsessed with his new puppy, Roosevelt. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. How are you doing today?
Oh my gosh, I've been up since about 6 a.m. I took my dog for a walk. It's been a busy morning already. Made some breakfast, but I'm here. I'm great. I'm happy to be chatting with you. It's been a while.
It's been a while, yeah. And just for the record, this is Monday morning, so it's 6 a.m. on Monday morning, and that's how we always kick off our weeks.
No one. Usually I'm in bed till about 7:30 and then I roll out, but my dog woke me up early this morning.
All right. Okay, we can still find that. Well, Michael, thanks a lot for engaging me today and with me today, and just tell me a little bit more about yourself. I know I just introduced you, but maybe a little bit more in a story format and like on a more personal.
Yeah. Goodness, what about me on a more sort of, I guess, personal level? I think, the way I'll start with, I think, how we met, which was through your, being in Venture for America and they connecting you with mentorship. And I think, something about the nature of how I've progressed through my career and gotten to where I am is I'm very fortunate to have had good mentors and leaders. And it's something that I've always wanted to strive to be. I think that there is currently across a lot of different pillars of our society, from business to politics to nonprofit work, we actually see a pretty significant dearth of leaders, and particularly a lack of leadership that doesn't foster people coming behind them and elevating in. And so throughout my entire career, I've really focused on trying to find ways to elevate that as a practice in my own life and then also evangelize it for others. And so, from my time at a telecommunications firm where I spent a decade really understanding my career, I really derive a lot of my success from two factors, which is luck and people believing in me and giving me an opportunity, and saw sort of some innate talents that maybe at some times I didn't see it myself. And then a little bit more, I think, on the personal side, that's how I got involved with New Leaders Council, slowly going through the program and then really investing a lot of my time and efforts to making certain that the local chapter here in Columbus, Ohio was really successful, and then stewarding the process of building out what good board governance can look like on a local chapter, evangelizing that to some regional chapters across the Midwest, and then really getting more access on the national side and contributing a lot of leadership and thought work across the organization, helping them with their strategic planning for a new vision and mission statement, and then evangelizing that across the organization. So now I am the treasurer of the whole darn kit and caboodle, which is wild. And then outside that, music has always been a passion of mine. Writing has been a passion of mine. And so I've used to be a big poet, and now I've moved on to product satire, which I'm really enjoying a lot about. I'm getting ready to work on something new currently. And so, that would say a little bit more about sort of, I think, the important part of my journey. That's less about, what role did I have and why did I have it and how that happened or what big cool projects that I work on. I really think it's down to luck and people really have believed in me. And then I would say that my work was a distant third, because I don't think I would have been here had I not done good work. But I think the first two was luck and just sheer opportunity.
I'm glad you mentioned hard work, because if you didn't, I would.
Yeah.
You definitely work hard, and you don't only work hard for yourself, but you work hard for others, because um, it was for free that you mentored me, and I will be forever grateful to you, because I think you really contributed a lot to my personal success, and something that I'm ready to say about you after I have known you for a while is that you truly give yourself to others. So we've met through sort of formal mentorship, right? Venture for America, great organization, partnered well, created a platform for young people like me and young people like you to meet. And
Thank you for being young. I really appreciate that.
of course you are, but we'll talk about it later because in your recent blog that you started is this something that we haven't mentioned yet in your intro, right? Dignified product, a new blog that you just started, and I've seen an article about how Zoomers versus millennials talk at the meetings and how to bridge this gap sometimes.
Very, very poor
We'll
way.
talk about it
Don't
in a
read
second.
anything on that blog for advice.
But I want to start like with your mentorship since you also mentioned it, right? So was it when you were younger and you were starting your career, did you have formal mentorship? Did you like how did you find these first people who shared their career advice with you?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I don't think it was ever formalized, but I would say my first real mentors were probably teachers that I had in elementary school, folks that really saw something about me for whatever reason, and again, continued to give me an opportunity. And I think I took a lot of that for granted because for some folks, elementary school is easy. It's not as rigorous a part because when you get to like college or something where you have to have like discipline to show up and do things like that. And so I would say that once I got to college, I really found a mentor through Professor Joy Riley, who was a theater instructor. And she was the chair of the Ohio State University's theater department for a little bit of time. And I just went to her office hours because she seemed like a fascinating human being. I remember when she talked to us about Dadaism, which is a type of sort of slapstick theater that almost feels pointless. And she opened up her lecture to 400 people by peeling a banana on stage, eating the whole thing in silence, and then chucking banana peel into the audience of students. So she's sort of like a little zany. And I went to her and I sat in her office and talked to her. And I told her that I was interested in writing, but I was an astronomy major at that time. And she's like, no, you should be a writer. Go switch your major. And she convinced me essentially to, she kind of inspired me, not really convinced me, to switch my major. And then for the 4 years that I was in college at Ohio State, I really stayed very connected with her as a writing mentor. Um, she was probably the first informal mentor who gave me a sense of confidence in this skill that I sort of was like budding and building. Um, and she put me in, enrolled me in classes that were far above what I should have been as a freshman.
Hmm.
But she really saw something, and I continued to meet with her even after graduating for several years. She asked me to come and give critiques and reviews to her other undergrad and graduate student work for new writing. And so, if I take a look at one formative mentor, I just called her on her birthday a couple months ago. She turned 83.
Wow.
Yeah, and she's incredible. I've known her since 2004. And I think there's something else that's really magical about that because she reminds me of I was raised by my grandfather who passed away in 2016 at the age of just shy of 82, and sort of the individuals who sort of sit in that silent generation, somewhere between sort of the silent and right after the boomers, or before the boomers, I should say, is a group of people that I just really admire and have a lot of resonance with. And I think that's something that just really she drew out of me is a sort of connection and compassion that I have with my grandfather that she sort of also embodied. And then I think at the telecom firm, I have to give a shout out to, and this will name the firm, but I want to name this person, an executive director that I had named Dalan, who really just saw a different way of hiring people that thought different from her
Hmm.
in order to challenge the assumptions that she would be making. And she would put me on random projects without any context, and she would give me just enough so that I wouldn't fail, but I had to work hard to achieve. And she saw that I could do it, and she was fortunately very right in trusting me with some of the big projects that we had. But from a personal side and a professional side, that's been a couple of really key mentors. And then I think when I left the telecom firm, I started my own consultancy for a little bit, and one of my clients, I would say, also became kind of a mentor, and we really mentored each other. I mentored him on technology, operations, and strategy work, but he really mentored me in some regards on managing a family business, which is something I don't think I'll ever do.
Hmm.
But the nature that comes with managing family members and also being able to separate sort of the emotional connection you have with people if you're ever working with friends. I think this is a really useful skill towards understanding what's the need for a business. And I think that's also helped me in my mentorship process through, like you said, we've become friends. We met in New York several months ago in person. And, I think that I always approach things from some sense of compassion and care, but more specifically, I always want to make certain that there's value being added to that relationship. And I think that he taught me really the same way as like, I care about my family, but we always have to be thinking about how do we build value for the people we serve. And the things he was doing was community housing, affordable senior developments, and equitable energy distribution for green energy projects.
It's the person with a family business that
Yeah.
was here. Mm-hmm. That's awesome. And I really like the way you put it with, well, you started like with the formal education, because I think for a second I forget about this big formal part. Like sometimes we are sort of like moving in our social interactions into more, boot camps and like programs, you know what I mean? We're kind of like moving away from traditional educational products, educational institutions, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And for a second, like I forgot about this huge part of our lives. And if you ask me, like who I'm grateful for, I would also think about this key people who contributed to my education and went above and beyond. I think it's just like they could provide like this bare minimum, but they really, and there are a lot of people, shout out to them.
Yeah. I mean, the care that for an adolescent to feel seen and heard by an educator really matters. I could go on a huge rant about how I think this part of the world has started to devalue that.
By the way, if you like this content, do subscribe to the channel Do It Nadia on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and all major podcasting platforms. There's going to be a lot of interesting content, interviews, people, mindset.
But I won't.
No, that's awesome. And yeah, for the record, we have been meeting only online. I'm in New York City. Mike is in Columbus, and we have been meeting for over a year, I think, online.
Definitely for a year.
Met in person in New York City when Michael came for. Can you talk a bit more about that? Because I think that's also an interesting part of your life.
Yeah, so I now work at a small startup consultancy called Pathfinder Product here local in Columbus, and we're just a bunch of product geeks. We love product management. We obsess about it. We figure out how can we help make it better. And then, through this firm, they had a small relationship with the Silicon Valley Product Group under Marty Kagan and Leah Hickman and that crew. And Marty launched this Coach the Coaches, or I should say Silicon Valley Product Group, launched this Coach the Coaches for product management professionals, first in London. I think it was back last March. And then in December of 22, they really pushed for an American audience. And it was 50 product professionals that applied, and they only took folks from smaller organizations. So they didn't want sort of in-house or big ones. They wanted really small consultancies that focused on coaching. And that was a really incredible opportunity to go through. I learned a lot in this 2-day sort of big group session, and then made a lot of connections within the product community in North America, or I really should say the Americas, because we even had people from South America there. It was really global in the presence, but it was fantastic.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think you were the person, well, I'm sure you were the person who introduced me to SVPG, right? Silicon Valley Product Group. And I read Marty Kagan's book, and that's really shaped my mind in terms of how to approach product management. So can you share a bit more about this organization, why you joined it, like how they found you or you found them?
When you say organization, you mean Pathfinder or SVPG?
Well, I mean SVPG
Yeah.
in terms of at least like this opportunity.
So I mean, it was really random. So our executive at Pathfinder had a relationship informally with one of the partners at SVPG, Leah Hickman. He ended up working and being recommended as a chief product officer for a firm in Europe. And so he took the interim role while also managing our company. So shout out to my CEO, who's a boss. Although every time I talk to him in person, I always make fun of him because he has to keep you gotta keep him in check. but no, he's great. But we reached out sort of coldly, me and a colleague who worked, for my firm Pathfinder, and just was like, well, we're not going to wait. We're just going to submit our stuff and see if they do anything. We had some informal connections, but really there wasn't much to it. It was a Google form. We filled it out, and they picked us, which was crazy.
And
And I'm
that's
surprised they picked both of us.
and that was a hard competition, right? You said
Yeah.
that a lot of people applied.
Oh yeah, and they only selected 50, and then you had to provide, like it was free, but you had to provide your own lodging and travel to New York City and whatnot.
Mm.
But it was great to have the opportunity where that was free. I don't think had I stayed at one of the big four consultancy firms that I was at briefly for about 6 months and just realized it wasn't for me, I wouldn't have got that opportunity. I would have gotten many other opportunities, but I think there's something about at this point in my life, and I like to say this a lot. I don't care about making already wealthy people wealthier, right? So I don't need to work for a large firm
Hmm.
in order to make some shareholders and executives ridiculously wealthy through really good work when I could really devote that in a consultancy role, make more money for myself and my smaller firm,
Hmm.
um, and really still build out better outcomes that help focus. And right now, I'm trying to get this firm to focus more on, while they're a logistics firm, at the end of the day, they impact customer care and patient care. And what I'm interested in is how can they facilitate better interactions with care providers, payers, and pharmaceutical firms to drive better outcomes of care for patients, because I think that's inspiring. I think it's something that is more meaningful to an engineering team than, hey, let's just go out and make more revenue and figure out any way we can to do that. And oftentimes that usually drives bad behaviors and poor business cases, and things that appear deliberately malfeasant to people outside of an industry, but really it's just gross incompetence, right? A lot of issues that you might see where companies get fined, in many cases, not always, is usually gross incompetence.
Yeah, that's okay. That's fine. And you get involved in a lot of volunteer work, social entrepreneurship, ethical business, let's say. And do you think it has to do with your background, or where is it coming from?
Well, that's a good question. I think growing up in a labor household helped shape my worldview quite substantially. So I was raised by my grandfather, who was, well, I was born in 86. He was 1934, so he was 52. I think that math works out. Yeah. And when I was born, and he basically raised me from birth. I had very young parents. They weren't responsible, and so there was a lot of like sacrifices that this individual had to make in his 50s to raise a child.
Yeah.
And my grandfather being this man who, of the silent generation, kind of curmudgeon-y, not super socially progressive for raising a gay adolescent, which came out, when I came to college. But I think I watched my grandfather's sense of sacrifice and duty, especially in my 20s and 30s. Recollecting when he passed away in 2016, when I was 30,
Mhm.
just how much tremendous sacrifice he had made, and I was always aware of that. But I think the value of that level of thinking beyond yourself, which he did not have to take me in, and my life could have been very different. Um, that was really, really impactful for me in ways that I still unpack to this day. Some of the lessons that he taught me informally, through just sort of the observation of his actions and how he moved through the day, was really, really valuable. I think also the fact that I remember he picketed for better wages and better safety as a plant. Most of the time, laborers are not picketing solely for pay, but really it's about workplace safety and better healthcare conditions. Those are things that really tend to drive a lot of people into crippling debt or get injuries that impact the rest of their lives, particularly if you're talking about factory work. And I think a lot of organizations focus so little on protecting their employees, both mentally and physically at times, that they see just the fines or a workman's comp claim as just the cost of doing business, which to me is unacceptable. If we're going to build organizations that improve the lives of our people and provide real value in a marketplace, we also have to make certain the same organizations are protecting the people who are making that possible. And so I think about that. I think that propelled me in watching the erosion of labor rights in this country, frankly, over the past 20 years that I really became aware of it. I think it's unacceptable. I think anyone who sort of looks down on union membership as trying to get too much, that really devalues the dignity of all work. And I do think all work is dignified. I've always made it a point in a large office setting where you'll have a janitorial staff that's outsourced, come and clean. I always make it a point to talk to them and get to know them.
Yeah.
Like those are just things that are innate because I value the dignity of work because I grew up in a labor household. That messaging was continuously put into me that all work matters, no matter how sort of undignified it may appear. That all matters. And then I think about how that progresses into our civics. I think that's what got me engaged in a lot of other civic engagements to really improve some inequities that I see across our communities from a leadership perspective to, how America deals with unhoused people or how it doesn't deal with them, I should say, right?
Right.
And these are all the things that we see every day, and I wonder how people turn blind eyes to it. And even myself, like, still manage to, but it is something that I'm at least acutely aware, and I'm aware of my own blind spots in many cases when that occurs. And so I just try to keep that at the forefront. It really kind of guides me as a compass, if you will, on how I operate.
Right. And we will not go deep into this big issue with homelessness in America, but just shout out to this small grassroots organizations which really uplift and help this community. Because I was doing a small research and comparison what the homelessness is like in Russia versus in the States, and one thing that I saw is that there are it was a while ago, so don't quote me here, but let's say there are 5 times more organizations in the U.S., small organizations, I guess medium size and large ones, which help homeless people. And I just found this exciting in terms of this is what Americans are for me. This is what I saw. People often mention how individualistic Americans are, and I will not deny that. But at the same time, I hear a lot about, and I know people who care about the community, who work for nonprofit organizations, or their businesses are ethical and they do things for improvement. And this is something that I haven't seen in my home country at this level, and that's really inspired me. That made me ask question: what can I do? What I can do for planet communities and things like this. So I just want to give some credit, to people who do improve these conditions. Do you think that what was the most difficult part of growing up with a grandfather instead of parents?
Yeah, I think to be vulnerable about this, it was that my grandfather, being a member of the silent generation, was not emotive. And he could not express often how he felt about much, very stern and stoic. And I think as someone who was a relatively sort of, I wouldn't say, I wouldn't call myself super emotive, but I was certainly an emotional child that pined for the affection of 2 parents that I just never had. And so I think that dichotomy where my grandfather felt a certain amount of resentment at my mother, which would be his daughter, for not providing and caring for me, as well as my father, and the clashes that we would have because as a child and adolescent, I didn't have the capacity to understand that, and he didn't have the capacity to share that in a constructive way. And so it always kind of blew up at times when I was a little more emotional. I think that was a significant piece of growing up in that environment, is that the family system dynamic was extremely broken at all levels. But there was sort of this stabilizing factor that he had because he was always constant, right? And that was helpful. But he did not have the tools and understanding of how to deal with that emotional complexity, not just for me, but also for himself. I recall one time in my 20s and late 20s, as my grandfather was, just getting older and, his kidneys were failing. And he was really slowing down. I remember asking him, what do you think your children think of you? And I always learned from my therapist, never ask an older man what he feels, always ask him what he thinks, and he'll tell you how he feels. And he told me something really illuminating. He said, I don't know, and I prefer not to think about it. And it really helped resonate with a lot of my childhood. You know, he said some horrific things about the fact that he felt forced to raise me, which wasn't. This was a choice that he made. But as an adolescent, feeling that way and then recollecting on the thoughts that he shared closer toward the end of his life, where I think he couldn't fully announce that he had these huge regrets, but the way he talked through how he didn't want to think about some of the wrongs maybe he had on his children, and he absolutely did. I mean, the man was not perfect by any means. He raised me very well, but I was raised much different than his. You know, I think that sort of journey of emotional acceptance amid a lot of confusing sort of times of growing up in that environment was probably the hardest, harder than even coming out as a gay man to someone who was vehemently opposed, but loved me enough to overcome that opposition. Took him a little bit, but we got through it. But that sense of not having the tools and capacity to navigate the emotional experience of a young child growing into adolescence who felt unloved was probably the hardest part of that.
Thank you for being so vulnerable. I think this really helps other people who probably have gone through something similar. And if someone on a different edge of the earth, maybe in Australia, maybe somewhere else, hear this story, and maybe they're in their teens now, and they can resonate with you, I think that serves the purpose of this conversation.
Yeah, because I think, and I want to harp on the fact that like there's a lot of context that's missing, but I think if you focus explicitly on the fact that in instances where there is absent parents, it is impossible for a child not to feel a sense that they are unlovable. And if you are a single parent who has an absent co-parent, if you are a family member raising a child that is not your own, and the parents of that child are not equipped to be a good parent, either from substance abuse issues or other life choices that they've made, or just circumstances, right? I mean, not everything is about choices. Some things are just circumstantial, and often it's a weird combination of all of those.
Yeah.
But that is something that I think everyone who is caring for a child in that specific type of scenario should have that conversation to allow them to feel and express that sometimes they feel unlovable, because they invariably will, from my experience.
How old were you when you started therapy?
Goodness, how old was I? 2020. It was 2010, before my 24th birthday, so it's 23. I started January of 2010.
And do you think it would help you if you started earlier?
Oh, I don't know, because I think if I started it earlier, it probably wouldn't have been my choice. Like my grandfather would have put me through it in high school, and I think that I had a skill that I developed early on because of the conditions of my childhood was that I could disconnect real well, but not in a super unhealthy way. But I was really able to sort of compartmentalize bits and pieces of myself to sort of cope. Now, you do that enough times, and then you can really drive into some really serious psychological conditions over time. But you know, fortunately, I didn't do that. I don't know, had I gone to therapy and it wasn't my choice, I don't know. That's a really great question that I've never considered, and I don't know how to answer it. I will say though, I am extremely fortunate that the first therapist I found was great, and I've stayed with that therapist ever since. I actually have a session Wednesday with him.
Did you say was gay?
No, he's straight, a straight white man.
I didn't hear you. You were fortunate that he was.
Oh, he was my first therapist. So I've seen the exact same therapist since January of 2010.
Oh, yeah. Not most people kind of have this journey. It's like finding a partner and trying, kind of having conversation with different people. So I think that's good. But something that I often think to myself when I think about you, and I have thought a lot about you and your journey, if I confess, then you could have become a complete wreck given the circumstances.
Oh, absolutely. There was probably a time in my 20s I was a complete wreck.
I mean, you could easily have become a drug addict, homeless, whatever, just being a gay boy, being raised by a grandfather like with whom who was not always emotionally available, if we put it like in a mild way.
Yeah.
And
I mean, you're
you could
100%
just have kind of like run away, and but you didn't. You made a great career, you help others, you helped yourself, and I think this is a phenomenal case.
Thank you. I think, one of the reasons my mother could raise me is because she had substance abuse issues, right? And so I think that is also the children of addicts typically will dabble and fall into it. I was always so terrified of it. I'm no longer terrified of that anymore, but I was terrified that I was an addictive personality. And I think in my 20s, I probably drank way too much as a young gay boy, going out to the bars and really just living his life. And I think this is also an experience that a lot of gay men who came of age in the late 2000s and the early 2010s is sort of like this burgeoning cultural acceptance of just otherness that sort of arose. There was sort of this celebration, I think, among the entirety of ethos of sort of gay men specifically, but I would say gay people overall, or anyone who identifies along LGBTQIA spectrum.
Mhm.
Um, we saw Obergefell v. Hodges, allow for gay marriage across the country. And there was sort of just this celebratory, we've made it kind of atmosphere that I think in probably drinking a lot in my 20s, was also sort of celebrating through the 2010s, this sort of notion that, like, wow, we really made it and I can be who I am and I feel safe and secure in a way that now um, there is a certain vigilance that I approach the world today
Mm.
because of attacks on queer people, because of attacks on trans and drag queens, trans individuals and drag queens, not to connect them, they're two separate groups. Um, but those attacks really are impactful. And I think that all of my friends and I have had discussions around the while we feel comfortable and confident enough to go out into spaces, we now carry an extra sense of vigilance, and that just wrestles up within you a certain amount of anxiety, particularly because of gun violence and the amount of guns. There's a lot of states like Ohio trying to make gun access even more unrestricted, which is nuts to me. But then the fact that several weeks ago, there was a drag show in Columbus that was protested by people openly waving giant Nazi flags. And I also want to take a point that this is a very white worldview perspective that I've opened up into, and that it is something that my black friends have shared with me, that this has been a sense of privilege that I've had, that I haven't walked through life without this sense of fear. Um, Anytime a black person sees something like a Confederate flag, it is no different to that black person than a Nazi flag to me, or a Nazi flag to a Jew, or some sort of direct hate speech
Yeah.
that lessens you as an identity. And so I just walk around now with this certain sense of vigilance that I really worry for young queer and LGBT and frankly black children who are dealing with these attacks on African American education. That I worry what's going to happen in the 2030s for these kids who are growing up, and what sort of trauma is going to do in them. Because I think I was fortunate to grow up in the 90s, which was sort of like this miraculous golden age of America, and then the 2010s as a gay boy who felt accepted by a society, and now we're really attacking children who don't have that same sense, and I worry about what 2030 will look like for a lot of those kids.
That's really interesting, and especially for someone who had who has different background, right, and who was not raised in the U.S. The 90s in Russia were complete wrecks, like the opposite, and people often mention them as the hardest times. And I often hear people here in the States saying about the blossoming, the great blossoming of America in 90s, and some people really miss this time, want to go back there. Um, in certain aspects, of course, but
Right.
but when you were talking about the black experience, like I had goosebumps, right? Like the same as seeing the Nazi flag. I think this is the message that white people would understand across the world, because the Confederate flag does not speak that much to the rest of people of any color, just in different parts of the world, I guess.
Right.
And hopefully our conversation goes international and we reach
Wouldn't that be wonderful?
different parts of the world, right? This is crazy. And do you think that being gay somehow had an impact on your professional life?
You know, um, not really, and I'm fortunate in that regard too, because again, I entered the workforce as sort of this burgeoning momentum of acceptance was occurring, and so I never felt like I had to hide myself. And I also think that I'm relatively I identify with my gender. I express myself as my gender that I was born into and my sex, and so I think that has made it easier for me. I think in a way that trans individuals or people who are gender queer struggle with, because people just inherently don't see me as much of an other as they may see others, and that's wrong for the observer to feel that way. And so, I think that has been a benefit for me. Is just that I've identified and expressed myself in a way that aligns to what culture says my gender and sex are. So that's helpful. And back when I entered the workforce, it was pretty much commonplace. Like there was all these employee resource groups opening up. There was a lot of engagement for promoting sort of pro accepting workforces. And so for me, I never felt it held me back. If anything, there's this great audio meme that, and I can't remember what all the details are, but I kind of feel like if anything, being gay has given me the audacity to just go out and do things that otherwise I don't think I would have done. Well, I don't know, maybe I would have, but like I feel like there's this meme that says, I've never really built a shed, but how hard could it be? Besides, I'm gay and I'm good at everything. There's sort of this weird, strange trope of gay men just like tackling something and being good at it. I don't think that's true by any means. There's plenty of things that I'm really bad at, like piano. And so, I don't really have a comment specifically, even though I rambled on for a little bit about any sort of adversity I think I faced or issues. I do worry, though, what happens in the next 5 to 10 years if our society falls into the trappings of saying we've gone too far toward acceptance, which I don't think we did. I think we hit a pretty solid piece and need to continue moving towards it. But I don't know. I expect at every turning point of American history, we've turned toward progress. So even when schools were desegregated in the 60s, people showed up to throw stones at Black children. How horrific. So it's not like every point where we've made some progress, we haven't backfallen a little bit. It's pretty substantially. I mean, when women's suffrage happened, there were men attacking women violently as soon as sort of women started to advance rights. When Black people got the right to vote, there were then Jim Crow laws. And so at each point of every progressive moment in our society, we have really had strong countercultures enact violence on the groups that were progressing. And I think that we're probably in that space again. This is probably the most terrified I've ever felt in my life for my safety, just going out into public at times. But I do have confidence that we will turn this corner and those people will be relegated back to the shadows of society eventually.
Right. What do you think about this questionnaire? So whenever you apply for a job, right, they in a lot of companies they do ask you, do you identify as, and then they give you some company give like a very elaborated list, pansexual, asexual, and everything. How do you feel about these questionnaires when applying for a job?
Um, I I think it depends on how the question's asked. I think a question that is, to your point, more expansive of various identities means that that company probably actually cares about hiring diverse sets of individuals, as opposed to a organization that may have limited choices that don't reflect the nuances of people's various and multifaceted identities. I think that might be for performance. I don't have an opinion either way because I actually don't know exactly how a lot of that data gets used outside of touting diversity, equity, and inclusion statements. And then if you hire enough of those people, invariably they're going to form some kind of resource group to help make certain that their needs are met and protected and that the organization considers them, which I think is really beautiful and valuable. But I don't think I have an aversion to it. But I do think I notice when their lists aren't as expansive, and that would just give me cause of question of how much into the values are they that they may say they tout for DEI work, as opposed to expressly like focusing on what they do. And I also think some of the survey questions might be government aspects for like EEO, equal opportunity employment. And so I don't really have a lot of consideration or concern for it. But I think when they expand those, I care a lot more. I can see their values in action.
Yeah. I think we're going to be wrapping up our conversation in a minute. If you just before we close the session, can you give some suggestions, whether these are podcasts or books? One topic would be just open-mindedness, right? How to, in terms of whether it is about being part of LGBTQ plus community. One topic would be like product management, and then maybe psychology or something like this, or whatever else you want
Yeah.
to suggest. I'm just giving some ideas.
I cannot recommend enough the podcast More Perfect out of WNYC. It talks explicitly about the Supreme Court, and they just did a really complex expose on Clarence Thomas, which was really fascinating to understand. And me, as a liberal who is not the biggest fan of Clarence Thomas, I really appreciated the care and diligence they did to present him as a rational actor of someone who comes from the era of the civil rights movement as a Black individual and how that shaped his perception on the bench. So that's one. And all of their stuff is good. There's a spinoff of Radiolab, which is a second plug for another podcast. As far as books, Melissa Perry's Mind the Build Trap, or The Build Trap by Melissa Perry. 100%, if you're going into product management, specifically on an enterprise, read that book, because it's the most practical book I've ever read on how to manage the bullshit that enterprises throw in their face. And they get it. Enterprises have a lot of competing priorities. I think every executive should read Radical Focus by Christina Wodke, because if you focus on everything, then nothing's a priority. Or if a task is everyone's job, like data governance, then no one is doing it. It's no one's job if you're not putting someone in the sheriff's house. So those two books, those two podcasts. I really love slapstick podcasts. So if you want, and they just wrapped it up, and I have to give an attribution to my ex who introduced me to this podcast, but My Dad Wrote a Porno is filthy fun. It's three Brits. They read this smut that one of their dads wrote and self-published on Amazon. It's this international phenomenon, but it is so funny. It's so delightful. It forces you not to take things so seriously. And it's just a riot of laughter. And so I really recommend that if you just need some joy and engagement in your life. And then I really love The Verge's podcast. And a lot of the leaders they bring on, they had a really great interview with Tony Fadell, who was one of the original designers for iOS and the first iPhone, and his book, which I haven't read yet, but I want to. I've only read a bunch of like interviews with him, sort of as he went on his book tour. Seems to be something that I'm going to start reading probably later this year once I get through Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead, which is a beautiful work of fiction that is just transformative, as a good friend of mine told me. So there's some recommendations.
Yeah, absolutely great recommendations. Thank you, Mike, so much for this conversation, for sharing your knowledge and light with the world. And I'm looking forward to talking with you again.
Yeah, it's always great. Have a wonderful rest of your day and a good start to your week.
Thank you.
Bye, friend.
That's Nadia Kugrashova show. Subscribe and all that stuff. Bye.
Bye.